as to how this came about. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Greg Peterson, president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And the Robert H. Jackson Center, as many of you know, was created only 7 years ago to expand and extend the legacy of Justice Robert H. Jackson. Part and parcel of that legacy of Justice Jackson is the fact that he was the chief American prosecutor at the International Military Tribunal, commonly known as the Nuremberg trials. Significant when you think that he came from here and was born in Warren County, spent his high school days in Frewsburg. His 13th year was at Jamestown High School, never went to college, never graduated from law school, yet became the answer to the Jeopardy question, named the only man who was a Solicitor General, Attorney General, and Supreme Court Justice of the United States, and it's a guy from here, Robert Jackson. That's kind of cool. Well, as we've been trying at the Jackson Center to understand the mosaic of him, the biography, if you will, of him, we've been able to track down many of those folks who were part of his world, part of the world at Nuremberg. Must tell you, one of the source books that we've had, at least I had at the beginning, in 1994, there was a book put out by Joseph Persico entitled Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial. Subsequently became a movie which Alec Baldwin starred in. As we got started, and my normal interest in things oral history, we had a chance to look at the acknowledgement pages. One of the nice things about books is you look at the acknowledgements and try to ascertain who's alive, who is potential to be talked to about Justice Robert Jackson. Along the way, we had a chance to interview an individual called Drexel Sprecher. Drexel Sprecher, for years, had put together a reunion of Nuremberg folks. We had a chance to, he gave me that was Adam Bratton, our new executive director. He handled that very well, don't you think? For those that don't know Adam, give him a big hand. He's directly involved with communications, you can see. Harold, you should be so proud. So the story, I interviewed Drexel Sprecher, and he gave me a copy of his directory, the directory he used to pull together a reunion. And I thought, gee, this is terrific. Let's try to track this down. Now, you must know how I work. I usually have a camcorder like that. In fact, that was it. In my back of my car. I'm traveling one day to Lansing, Michigan to see my daughter. And at the same time, while I'm driving, I am rifling through this list. Because in the back of my mind, I thought maybe there might be somebody on the way from Jamestown, New York, traversing 90 and working my way up to Lansing, Michigan, that might be of interest. And sure enough, there, as I see a sign that says Ann Arbor, 20 miles. And I said, Ann Arbor, Ann Arbor, Ann Arbor. So I'm driving, and I'm going through this catalog of stuff, and sure enough, there's a guy named Allan Dreyfuss, and it describes him as being a reporter for Stars and Stripes. Ann Arbor, great. Next thing you know, I get on the cell phone, and then see the sign that says Ann Arbor, 10 miles. Next thing you know, I call, and on the phone comes one Allan Dreyfuss. I said, Allan Dreyfuss, I'm Greg Peterson, Wondered if I might have a chance to interview you at some point, and he said, what day would you like to do that? I said, today. What time today would you like to do that? And I said, well, I've just passed a sign that said Ann Arbor, 5 miles. Can we do it now? So Allan Dreyfuss was good enough to permit me to stop by immediately, and we interviewed Allan Dreyfuss. Incredible story. Incredible story that he was, in fact, reported the Nuremberg trials for Stars and Stripes. A guy who was from Brookline, Massachusetts, graduated from the University of Chicago, joined the Air Force, then part of the U.S. Army, where he worked, as I mentioned, on Stars and Stripes. After the war, we learned that in the Nuremberg trials, he worked for Reuters news service based in Germany. He was asked to head the Scandinavian office of Radio Free Europe, based in Stockholm, Sweden, from 1952 to 1954. He then headed the Radio Free Europe office based in Paris from 1954 to 59. And in 1959, he and his family moved to New York State, where he worked as a speechwriter for New York City Mayor Robert Wagner, for those who remember. In 1963, he joined Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. He worked in the international public relations and wrote speeches for Henry Ford II, among others. While at Ford, he was also the historian for the New Detroit Committee, formed after the urban riots of 1968. Did you get a chance to interview Willie Horton as part of that, of the Detroit Tigers? No? Okay. Sorry, Gordy. He retired from Ford in 1992, and he has also written short stories, poems, novels, and plays, and just recently received an award for one of his plays. We're very excited about having him, but that's just part of the story, because when I got back, while I was there, I learned that he had written a book while at Nuremberg called These 21. And it was written for Stars and Stripes between the time period at the end of the trial, but prior to the rendering of the verdicts. And he cataloged every one of the defendants as to what happened during the trial. And he did this for Stars and Stripes. And then Stars and Stripes compiled this into a book called These 21. And if there are any left, Stars and Stripes gave a bunch of them to us because they reprinted it. And for those who didn't get one and there's any available, please take them on the way out. But when Allan showed me this, I asked him, this is a long introduction, but I think it's just unbelievable part of serendipity. I caught a hold of Stars and Stripes and asked them if they had any extra copies because I wanted an original. It then led to a conversation with Stars and Stripes, and they said, hey, Allan Dreyfuss, you talked to Allan Dreyfuss? He's alive? This is terrific. I gave him the coordinates. The next thing you know, they not only got my video, which then became part of the Stars and Stripes website, which I was thrilled to have, and that subsequently became part of the Jackson Center website. And then they got a hold of them, and then they created the reprints, of which the folks were kind enough to send to us today to share for you. And at no charge, I might add, from Stars and Stripes. It's a way for them to say, hey, we're still in business, and they're grateful for that work, which was done by Allan Dreyfuss. Fast forward a little bit. The same Persico book indicates, and it quotes several times, one Harold Burson. And you pause and you say, that can't be the same Burson, Harold Burson of Burson Marsteller, the foremost public relations firm in the world. And the answer is, it is. And in fact, they're going to learn something last night for those who are taking notes. Jim, there's a thing called Googleism. Googleism. And Googleism, in fact, you can look on there, and they have a certain thing under Harold Burson. And it said, Googleism for Harold Burson. Harold Burson is regarded as one of the world's preeminent public relations counselors. Harold Burson is legendary in the field of public relations. Harold Burson is one of those individuals who has helped shape our modern world. Harold Burson is the Burson in Burson. Harold Burson is chairman of Burson. 5 declarative sentences, which tells you an awful lot about an individual which you will learn more about shortly, and which some of you read about in the advanced material. But here's the story. I'm talking to Harold Burson. Now, this is Harold Burson way up here, and I'm figuring, how am I going to break through the plate glass to possibly get through him? Fortunately, he's a normal guy. And we actually talked, and the next thing you know, he said, gee, I'd be interested in coming to the Jackson Center. He then asked me, by the way, do you know anything? Does the name Allan Dreyfuss mean anything to you? And is he alive? They're interested, Allan. A lot of people are. And so I told him of my experiences, which I just related to you. And he said, I'd give anything to have the chance to catch up with Allan Dreyfuss. Why? Because they were colleagues in Nuremberg. One dealt with as the transcript writer for the radio productions from Nuremberg for our American Forces Network. So when if you would have heard the broadcast from Nuremberg trial, it was Harold Burson's. Harold Burson was also in Allan Dreyfuss's wedding more than 47 years ago. Allan Dreyfuss and Harold Burson haven't seen each other for over 30 years. So last night, here at the Jackson Center, aside from having two extremely distinguished people who covered the Nuremberg trial as reporters, which that alone is a highlight for me, and look forward to talking, they also had their own little private reunion, and it was just fun to watch. And so, on behalf of the Jackson Center and everybody here, we welcome Harold Burson and Allan Dreyfuss. And what I will do in just a few moments, well, we'll do now, is we're going to sit down and we're going to do an interview of the two of them, so you get to know these two folks in a more personal level. We find that format will work extremely well. And in order to kick it off, let me just start this scene. The American Forces Network broadcast, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany, November 21st, 1945. Good evening. This is Corporal Cy Bernhardt in the American Force Network special booth at the Palace of Justice. The small courtroom in Nuremberg today knew no walls, no boundaries of either time or space, for it was today that an impassioned and magnificent opening address, lasting almost 4.5 hours by Supreme Court Justice and United States Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, where he sought to encompass the memory, the conscience, and the future hope of mankind. The spectators in the court knew today that they were conscious participants in the shaping of modern history. And the 20 defendants, with one exception, in contrast to their generally indifferent attitude of yesterday, were intense, alert, and active listeners. And at times in the closing stages of the 61-page speech, their tired, aging faces reflected many passing thoughts, many remembrance of glories now past and dead. And this was the opening of the broadcast of the day of the opening of the Nuremberg trial in Robert Jackson, authored by Harold Burson. So, and obviously as part of that spectator group, shortly thereafter, a couple days thereafter, was one Allan Dreyfuss. So we're going to join me now in this conversation with these gentlemen. Harold, having just read that piece, obviously written by you and to be broadcast, what was your sense of the historic nature of that particular event?
Somehow or another, I realized that it was a moment of history. I'll have to confess to you that I was a bit more idealistic then than I am now, although I am not without hope. It was a very awesome experience for me, and I think most of the people who were in the courtroom, especially those who had covered World War II, who knew of the devastation of a good part of Europe, who had seen concentration camp firsthand, who knew that millions and millions of people had been displaced. And it seemed that this was mankind's reach for justice against those who had perpetrated what is arguably the largest, the most costly war in history. I think that in those days, I think the press was a lot more responsible than it is today. And I think my feelings were shared by most of the people in the courtroom.
Allan, what was your sense? The same thing as Harold's? You there on behalf of Stars and Stripes, handed an assignment. You walk in day one. Maybe I should ask that question first. Now, you walk in day one, and there you see the picture which we have up on the wall of the 21 defendants in the dock. What was your impression?
Well, to start with, I was just a GI. I'd had a lot of experience in the newspaper world, but as I came into that courtroom, I could hardly believe my senses. Because here, lined up in perfect array behind the prisoner's dock, were the men who were largely responsible for thinking these malevolent ideas, for impressing an unbelievably large segment of humanity that this was the wave of the future. And all of a sudden, I thought of other GIs who had less education, GIs who hadn't read, who hadn't traveled much, who didn't know other languages or other peoples. And I thought, well, I'm really privileged. I'm given a responsibility to interpret what goes on in this courtroom. There were other people watching, other people listening, other people observing. But all I could account for was my own self, my own sense of humanity, my own sense that this was terribly wrong. And so all I did was, I did the best I could, which probably in the scheme of things isn't very much. But all any human can do is do the best that he or she can do, and that was what I tried to do at Nuremberg.
Allan, you wrote Four Stars and Stripes, and therefore your audience was principally the GIs.
That's true.
Just expand a little bit on what you said. Did you get a greater sense that you had to explain in maybe greater detail why they fought and that this was perhaps the bookend of this activity?
Well, the point was that GIs at that time had been subjected to all kinds of information and education indoctrination. I&E became a slogan for undesirable pressure to make people conform in their ideas. And the American Army, unfortunately, misinterpreted for a while. And it brought to people the impression that the United States couldn't do wrong because it was ingrained in its founding documents, in its sense of history, in its unraveling course through history, and its battling with other countries for the right to be right. So we tried the best we could. And a lot of the things that we put out as fact, newsprint, were just ideas that were floating through the air. And we brought to them, we thought, a sense of dedication and purpose. Whether we succeeded or not is sometimes countermanded and denied by events that go on when we see cruel, inhuman, barbarous acts reperpetrated by many of the descendants of those who did them and suffered for them at Nuremberg.
Harold, going along the lines of a sense of your audience being the GI audience, I know you played that concept, and you played it well to accomplish something which no other reporter had. Why don't you explain that to the crowd?
Well, actually, our audience, our primary audience was, of course, the soldier population in Europe at the time, and it was still over 1 million soldiers in Europe 7 or 8 months after the war was over. In addition to that, AFN, which was the Army Radio Network in Europe, was the most credible news source in Germany among those people who spoke English. And the estimate was that there were 2 or 3 million Germans who listened to AFN and depended on AFN for their news. And I was told when I got the assignment by a major general, which was really equivalent to me going up and talking to the Pope. Of course, I was an enlisted man also. And saying that one of the reasons that we are going to give this as much attention as we are is that we want to be sure that the German people have an accurate view of what went on in the courtroom and what went on in Germany during their lifetimes. So I had the sort of dual duty of talking to my fellow GIs and also informing the German population what had gone on in Germany. And like Allan, I had had no experience of that magnitude. I'd worked on a newspaper in my hometown in Memphis. I was probably the youngest correspondent there. I was 24 years old. And the job seemed to me just a magnification of what I had done as a reporter when I was working on the Memphis Commercial Appeal, although multiplied by 10,000, 100,000, or 1 million, or whatever it was. And the awesome part of it to me was that literally I was there with the best reporters in the world, because that was the choice assignment in the world at the time. And I tried my best to at least not make an embarrassment for myself, because one thing was that they were able to hear the broadcast that I had written, and just as the reporters were able to read Allan's dispatches in the Stars and Stripes the next day, they couldn't see their own because they were representing papers outside of Germany, and in those days, even a paper getting back from London probably took 3 or 4 days. So it was a challenging experience, and I saved my scripts, and there was about a 25 or 30-year period that I didn't read them. And one day I just came across them about 20 years ago, and I started reading them and sort of tried to detach myself from those scripts. And I am very happy to say that I looked at those and really with a sense of detachment and said, you know, this is pretty good. and when I thought of this 24-year-old kid who was doing this, I thought it was darn good, you know. So I guess, you know, like Allan and other people, and this, I think, really won World War II for the Americans. You know, Stephen Ambrose once made the statement. He said, the generals did not win World War II for the United States. He said, the people who won World War II were the junior officers, the enlisted men, and American industry. And so Ambrose, as those of you who have read him, really praised the ingenuity and the drive and the effort of the American soldier, and even at the risk of self-praise, I really believe in that phrase, the greatest generation.
I'll read this script. The American Forces Network, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany, January 31st, 1946. Good evening. This is Sergeant Ted Piers in the Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. Last week, AFN correspondent Harold Burson submitted a list of 6 questions to Mr. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the Chief United States Prosecutor at the Nuremberg War Crimes Trials. These questions are the questions GIs themselves have been asking ever since these proceedings began. To provide the answers, we've invited Mr. Justice Jackson to speak directly to the American forces in the European theater. Heretofore, Justice Jackson had said no to every interview. How did one Harold Burson pull this one off?
Well, one of my objectives from the very first day of the trial, of course, was to reach Justice Jackson for an interview, which I was not unique in that. Every reporter who was there wanted to talk to Justice Jackson. He had taken a position that he was going to let the trial tell the story, and he was not going to go outside the regular legal channels to comment or discuss the trial or the case. When I was turned down the first time, I said, to myself, I've really failed in this, and I think that he should really talk to the troops. His press secretary was a man that I'd gotten to know, a man named Gordon Dean, and I ran into him 4 or 5 days after my turn down, and I said, Gordon, I think that Justice Jackson is really obligated to talk to the American soldiers, my audience, and I'm the only one who has that audience where he can talk directly. I said, these are the people who really were willing to give their lives to bring us to this place where Justice Jackson can be the American prosecutor. And Gordon Dean thought that was a very valid argument, and went to Justice Jackson with it. And in 24 hours, I got word back that the justice would entertain some written questions given to him in advance, and that he would submit to the interview. And it was the only interview that he had with a reporter as long as the trial was going on. He did have an exit interview when he returned to the United States.
I love the fact that you didn't take no for an answer. And now we have the transcript, and it's here. Allan, you had a chance also as part of the Stars and Stripes. Well, maybe we should back up. How did it work? How did you get your information to do your piece? Today, you see candidates, for example, they hand out press releases. They hand out the speeches. You didn't have access to that, did you?
Partially we did.
Mm-hmm.
I hate to disabuse you of these great ideas, but
You're still on a pedestal.
we didn't just haul things out of the sky. Most of the material we had been researched and examined by a number of our colleagues who were well experienced in the ways of Nazism and general responses to questions. And so when we consulted every single avenue that might yield a meaningful response, so that we never fired in the dark. We knew exactly where our enemy was, and we knew the direction from which its projectiles came. And so, in consequence, there was no scatter shot. It was all fairly well directed. I found through my experience, I had a lot of colleagues, and some of them had been in concentration camps. GIs who had been in concentration camps. And they could disabuse me of any ideas that there was anything noble or self-sacrificial about their incarceration. And so I got a very, very vivid and almost too accurate picture of the way things were.
I'm just going to read, this is from These 21, because you had a chance to obviously eyeball all the defendants, and you had a chance to put together this profile of each of the 21, the sum total of which is in this book. On Goering. After almost 10 months of sitting in the historic courtroom at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, losing 50 pounds and a flip disregard for the dignity of the occasion, Hermann Goering waits for the judgment of the court on his actions as number 2 man of Nazi Germany. The sober-visaged number 1 defendant, who reputedly had been the keystone holding together the organized defense of the 20 Nazi conspirators in the dock, presents a far different picture from the pompous, bemedaled egocentric who waddled through the high offices of the Hitler government, carrying out the mad designs of its leader with callow disregard for human rights and decency. When you looked at Goering, and obviously as you were putting together these words, did you get a sense that he was the representation of the Nazi government, that he was really there for the entire, was he standing for the Adolf Hitler?
Clearly, yeah. Yeah, he emerged from this welter of soi-disant dubious humanity that were occupying the dock, and he was one of the few who had a lucid, objective plan in his mind. I didn't read his mind, but this would be my interpretation, that he knew exactly where he was going and how he was going to proceed, and he regarded himself as the uncrowned leader of this motley group of malefactors and ne'er-do-wells.
Harold, you were there and wrote about one of the highlights of the Nuremberg trial was the marquee cross-examination between Jackson and Goering. It's got an awful lot of press. From your front row seat, what was that all about?
Well, to me, Goering was an awesome character. I think one of the most memorable people that I have ever seen in my life. Of course, I never spoke with him, but I had a seat in the courtroom where I could almost reach out and touch him. You've got to remember that Goering was different from most of the people with whom Hitler associated with and surrounded himself with. He was different because he came from a noble family. He had won the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, World War I, a genuine hero. He was very well educated. And he pitched in with Hitler shortly after the putsch in 1923, 1924. and he rose to be the second person in power. He certainly dominated the trial as far as the defendants were concerned. All of them sort of took a second seat to him. When Goering testified, I talked to many of my associates who were reporters, and there was almost universal agreement was how lucky we were that he wasn't the number one guy. You know, all of us felt, number one, he would never have gone into Russia. He would have never gone into North Africa, probably. That he was much more logical than Hitler was. He prided himself on being a soldier. He time and time again spoke about the honor of being a soldier and what it meant. And the most memorable moment in the trial for me was when he was being questioned. This was after Justice Jackson had questioned him. And I must say that I think that Goering got the better of Justice Jackson. And for the one reason is that Justice Jackson simply just did not know enough about the history. And Goering would get him tied up on little points, and he would demonstrate that he knew more about what the situation was than Justice Jackson did. Well, the British chief prosecutor, he wasn't the chief prosecutor, the number two prosecutor for British, was a man named Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. And he started cross-examining Goering, and the issue was 4 American Air Force officers who had been executed after having tried to escape from a Luftwaffe prison camp twice. And Maxwell Fyfe asked Goering the question, what is the number one duty of a prisoner of war? And Goering came back very quickly: to escape. And then he said, well, what do you think about this order to execute these 4 American prisoners on their second attempt to escape? And he again said, this is not a legitimate order for a military person who is an honorable person. And Maxwell Fyfe pulls out a document where Goering had signed the execution order for these 4 people. And I think from that point on, Goering started going downhill. It just really devastated him. Goering, from the very beginning, had indicated that he expected to die. And his only argument was his method of execution. And what he wanted was a soldier's death. A soldier's death is a death by a firing squad. He thought it was a disgrace to him if he were hanged. And of course, he got the last blow in the thing when he was able to commit suicide. But I think he was certainly was a man who did evil things. He deserved to be hanged. But again, as an individual, he was really not of the same ilk that most of the other defendants were. And there were other exceptions too in the trial. Albert Speer was one, for example. Von Neurath was another, a former foreign minister. Schacht, the financial man, was of a different character. And of course, the military people were a case of their own. But the rest of the people, you look at them and Basically, about a half a dozen were just a bunch of thugs.
Along that line, Alan, you wrote on Rudolf Hess. This was in 1946, you wrote, sallow, beetle-browed Rudolf Hess has been just as much an enigma to the International Military Tribunal as he was to the world's newspaper readers after he made his melodramatic flight to Scotland in 1941. 60 years has now elapsed. Has anything changed on the Rudolf Hess story?
I don't know if anyone has done an in-depth analysis of the troubles that beset the sallow, beetle-browed Mr. Hess, but his entire deportment didn't square with anybody who was logical and who expected some result from his actions. No, he was an enigma, and I think he continues to be an enigma. I think he had serious mental problems, but what they were, I'm not competent enough to answer.
Harold, you were there the day when he surprised the entire courtroom. There was, for the lawyers here, they had a day where just Hess was in the dock, and they had testimony after testimony of psychiatrists, psychologists, Test, Jackson. Everybody was there waiting and talking, trying to convince the judge that he was sane to conduct his own trial. And then things happened. Talk about that experience.
Well, he blurted out, "I'm guilty. I did it." And my feeling is that he did that because he wanted to show how crazy he was. And, I think that, Hess had a mental problem, a very serious mental problem, but I also think that he was in control of himself a good deal of the time. He was probably lost control of himself at other deals of time. But, he was just, his tirades and his activity and behavior just looked like it was planned. Trial would be going on, testimony would be going on, and he'd reach out in the back and pull out a little book, start reading the book during the crowd, muttering himself. And I even when he was in Spandau prison, he had his very, very lucid moments, according to what I read, and he had one or two family members who saw him fairly regularly. I'm sure that the only reason they kept him in prison until he died was that after the Cold War got really warmed up, and the Russians, separated Berlin with the wall, the only contact that the United States government had with the Soviet Union on a continuing basis was Spandau prison. And so I think that's the only reason that they kept him in there. Otherwise, they would have pardoned him. But the succeeding administrations just did not want to give up this contact link with the Soviet Union. But apparently, he, according to the guards, in his later years, he was a fairly normal person. But he certainly was a good game player if it was a game. Otherwise, I don't think he would have gotten any more stringent a penalty. I don't think he would have been executed. I think he probably would have gotten life imprisonment, or even maybe less if he hadn't been mentally unstable, because, he left very early. 1942, went to England. The reason he went to England was he thought he could negotiate a peace with some British friends in very high places in Britain. And of course, he was captured, and that never had any negotiations.
Alan, were you there the day when they showed the concentration camp movies? At the trial, when they shut down the lights, and all of a sudden.
I think I was, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just curious what the reaction of the defendants were, if you recall.
Well, some of them couldn't stand looking at the film. It was beyond belief. They couldn't credit their eyes with what their brains were telling them. And some of them just averted their glance and didn't want to watch. But after a while, I think, it became old hat to them. They could stand looking at some of this, but at the beginning it was just too much.
Yep. My recollection was that they sort of like this all during the showing of the film. Films probably took, about 40 minutes or so, like that.
Sir?
The films probably took like about 40, 45 minutes. And I'm telling you, whoever selected the footage made it as gruesome as you could really imagine. Women, children, totally nude, walking toward the gas chambers, and these bulldozers pushing bodies over into holes, people lined up at a long, long grave, their backs to the rifleman shooting them, and then they fall into the holes. It was just absolutely just horrible. And there was, it was an emotional scene, even for some of these hardened news people.
When you talked about the news community, the colleagues that you had, we have a lot of folks here who are part of the greatest generation. Why don't you, both of you, maybe drop some names of colleagues of yours that you work with, and it's kind of a toss, some folks. Alan?
I think Harold and I hold certain of our colleagues in high esteem. Howard Smith, for instance, I think he's number one. He was a CBS correspondent who showed great heart, who was an excellent reporter. He'd been at Louisiana's, I think.
Tulane, it came from Louisiana, yeah.
Yeah, but he'd been on the track team. He was an all-American boy in one way.
Well, he was a Rhodes Scholar actually too. He wrote a book that was a bestseller. It called it Last Train from Berlin. He was the last American correspondent to leave Berlin after Germany declared war against the United States. You got to remember, after Pearl Harbor, which was on Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, our time, which was late or early Monday morning on German time, the Germans declared war against the United States. We did not declare war against Germany. They declared war against us. And then the next morning, we declared war against the Japanese. But the reason that's been given for the German action is that they wanted to enlist the Japanese, get the Japanese on their side in the event that there was fighting in the Far East. They wanted the Japanese to fight the Russians. So they declared war against us, and then Howard left a couple of days later.
Weren't you on the radio, didn't you?
Sir?
With Howard K. Smith, did you pinch hit for him for a while?
Yeah,
How did that work?
works fine. I mean,
I'll come up with a better question.
Except he was a first-rate reporter. I was just a substitute.
So on CBS, you would have?
Yeah. But he was a powerhouse. He was an intellect, and he had a sense of humor, which is saving grace.
Now, one of the people that you often see there, because he's still among us, is Walter Cronkite. Now, was he a known commodity then, or is he just one of the many reporters?
He's always been a known commodity. He was a very good friend of ours, and Harold and he were very tight, very good friends.
Yeah.
He was
When I first met Walter, he was about 28, 29 years old, and had a very distinguished career as a war correspondent before Nuremberg. I think it's true that Walter made more bomb runs over Germany than any other correspondent. He did that from England back in 42, 43, 44. Not 42, 43 and 44. But he worked for United Press. United Press had a delegation of 4 reporters there, and Walter was number 4 on the list. And very frankly, if anyone had said to me that this man would become the most successful anchor, the most credible person in the United States, I would have said, what have you been smoking? But he just seemed to, I didn't see him for maybe 3 or 4 years before he became anchor man at CBS, and I saw him first time on radio. My God, this is Walter Cronkite, and he just, the medium was made for him. He couldn't show what he really was as a news reporter, but he certainly, when he got in front of a camera, he just did just marvelously well. I don't think anyone has come close to him since he left, and the only one that I can think of that I would put in his class was Edward R. Murrah before him. But he was a really a big surprise.
Is that your sense too, Alan? We might as well get this on tape.
Yeah. I'm inclined to agree. Yeah.
And a very nice man. He's very modest.
What was the camaraderie among the news folks? Did you guys gather together? Did you socialize together in the evening without defying or explaining any confident ability?
Yeah,
Very much so.
we all bunked at Stein Castle, or one of its outbuildings. That was where Mr. Farber, the pencil magnate, had his great place, and we were all delighted to be there. We were taken very good care of, I must say. But they had rivalries, and there was a very active rivalry amongst the wire services, and it used to be UP, INS, AP, Reuters, Agence France Presse, and there were about 6 of them, and they would do almost anything to sabotage their competition. This is not very generous or very kind of me to say, but you'd always have to watch out that somehow or other your dispatch that was supposed to go to Fleet Street didn't wind up in Timbuktu or someplace like that, But generally, most journalists were gentlemanly, and lady-like people, people who worked for excellent publications, the New Yorker and U.S. News and World Report, and they did very, very adequate coverage of their subjects.
Did you share leads?
Sometimes, but you'd have to be very, very good friends with somebody.
Yeah. They-
So like a guy like Harold Burson gets a lead on Jackson, that only came out after the fact, right?
Yeah, that's a fact. In making friends, I had a huge advantage over the other correspondents, and that is I was the only one of the several hundred who had his own wheels. The commanding officer of American Forces Network, for some reason, and I didn't ask for it, I wouldn't have dared ask for it, gave me a Jeep. And I had orders that I could get petrol from any petrol dump in U.S. Army territory. And so it was about 8 miles from where we slept and ate to the courthouse. And there was a sort of a jitney bus that ran every 15 or 20 minutes between the two. And of course I gave immediate door-to-door service. And I usually had passengers. Allan was probably my most frequent passenger, but I still remember two of my great passengers. One was Ann Stringer of United Press, and the other one Marguerite Higgins of Herald Tribune, New York Herald Tribune. I might add that I was unmarried at the time.
And so was Allan, I might add.
Yeah, that was Allan, yeah.
You read Allan's work.
Yeah.
This may be very personal, and
Yeah.
but what did you think of Stars and Stripes and Allan's work when you were there?
I thought it was very, very good. He generally agreed with what I coincided with what I had put out the night before.
All right, Allan, your turn. As you were listening to the Armed Forces Network, and you knew that obviously your driver was writing the scripts for Ted Pierce and Cy Bernard, what did you think of his work?
He probably didn't hear it.
I didn't pay attention to it.
I love honesty.
Yeah.
Here we are, we're sitting in the Jackson Center, roughly 62 years after Jackson's closing statement and sort of his wrap-up, and then the verdicts, which came after your publication, These 21. What's your sense of it all, Allan, as far as legacy and perhaps, if it hasn't realized what it had hoped to realize, what possibly could happen hereafter? How would you like to see it play out?
Well, it seems to me in retrospect that just the words Nuremberg have been ingrained in humanity's consciousness, that some people don't know what Nuremberg was, but they knew it was something evil. And I think the association in the minds of ordinary people who sometimes quote and refer to the Nuremberg trials or the Nuremberg verdict or the Nuremberg judgment are less specific in their application than they are in their overreaching sense of horror and their ability to transform people so that they know that this was a time of terror and terrible happenings for innocent people. And out of this, I think, came a resolve that it can't happen again. Never again. Never again.
Harold, what's your sense?
Well, let me put it this way. For about the past 25, 30 years, I have spoken on college campuses, either to the Graduate School of Business or to the schools of journalism and communications. And I would say that the various activities of mine that are listed on my bio, the one that usually comes out almost in every appearance that I make is tell us about your experience in Nuremberg. Now these are college students, now 2 generations, 3 generations removed from that event. And so it really amazes me that there is the interest that's being passed down when, generally speaking, I have great concerns about what these kids are learning in school today. But they seem to latch on to Nuremberg. Has just got some kind of a magical quality that captures their imagination. My own feeling is that the hope was that you didn't have to be a victor to try the vanquished. And so far you've had to be the victor because you have to go in and get the people that you want to put on trial. I do think that the Nuremberg situation, I'm pleased that it happened. Nothing I've ever done that gives me greater satisfaction than to have participated in it. But even though it hasn't accomplished its goals, I think it really points in a direction, and hopefully someday there will be an organization that other nations feel that nations of the world feel it's worth giving up their sovereignty in that area in order to try those people who break the laws of humanity in ways that were done in Germany. So I don't think it accomplishes its goals, but I think it certainly set an example. I suspect that if I look back on it, it gave me a lot of confidence. Here I was, a young man, and I was competing with, really the best people in journalism. And, I would be in the courthouse going to the trial or at lunch courthouse, and one of these people would say, caught your broadcast last night, and really, it was good reporting. And so I think it sort of gave me confidence that I could compete with the very best. And when Burson Marsteller started with just me in 1946, and I met a man named Bill Marsteller in '53, we started a joint company he was in the advertising business, held jointly by us. In 1983, we became the largest public relations firm in the world. And basically, I had the confidence, even in the earlier days, that we wanted to work for the most distinguished clients, not only in the United States, but in the world. And if I had not had the experience at Nuremberg, I don't know whether I would have put myself on that higher level. I may have had lesser goals. Of course, that and my own mother, I think she gave me the greatest of all things, and that was a sense of security. But I think that's what Nuremberg did for me. It just gave me a sense of confidence that I didn't have before.
Alan, what about you? As you went on to such a distinguished career in many areas, what did Nuremberg mean to you?
Well, it was a high point in my checkered career. But I found that I could compete with men whom I respected greatly, whose work I knew of, but with whom I'd had little personal contact. But I found that on balance, my work was absolutely as meritorious, as legitimate as anything that most of them did, and that I could compete and I could achieve things that I thought were worthwhile and helpful for all of humanity.
And I must tell you, on behalf of the Jackson Center, a couple of things have occurred. One is we've had made available in these 21, which is certainly a documentation of much that occurred at the Nuremberg trial, that which, of course, the Jackson and the Jackson Center is completely indebted. And to have all that Harold Burson accomplished, and his transcripts, which he donated to us, of which are incredible documentation of the Nuremberg trial, and our sense from the Jackson Center and what most of you have said here, that there is an interest in Nuremberg. There is an interest of what occurred there. There is an interest that Milosevic, Hussein, the trials which have been recently conducted, what's the model they're using, and they hearken back to Nuremberg. There is a keen interest, and that fits nicely into, of course, that which we are doing here. And we could not be more honored than to have one Allan Dreyfuss and Harold Burson come together as a personal reunion, a professional reunion, and a special magic moment for us. So on behalf of us all, we thank you. It's been terrific.